Hi, this is Jeffrey Wernick, and I'm going to try something I've never done before, which is just have my own conversation with anyone who's interested in listening to What the Wernick. One of my partners came up with the name, and so we'll see how this goes. So I'm not accustomed to looking and I guess my camera on my MacBook Pro and just talking. I generally like conversation rather than monologues, but I'm going to give this a shot and see how this goes. I wanted to share with those interested, my thoughts about people, uh, quote, celebrating Independence Day. I wrote a note to a number of the people I know, have some friendly relationships or some good acquaintances with, and I basically wrote to them that I'm not wishing anybody a happy Independence Day because for me, Independence Day is a day of mourning. And what do I mean by uh, Independence Day being a day of mourning is because I think if anybody was familiar actually with what the grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence, those grievances that indicated that since these grievances were ignored, uh, that basically the colonies were declaring their independence from the British Kingdom, from the British Empire, and declared their independence as a fact because of grievances unattended to. And they basically made a decision to secede and be independent and declare that certain values is what was the reason for the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So why I say it's a day of mourning is because we have a long time ago killed, assassinated any sense of independence. We decided to be independent of one sovereign and then be subject to another sovereign, and probably the conditions of our own individual sovereignty are significantly worse than they were at the times of when we declared ourselves independent from the British sovereign. So first, I'd like to review some of the grievances that were listed in the Declaration of Independence that caused us to declare independence and secede as a fact. So, one of them says for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Well, we don't really have quartering of troops among us in the sense of them occupying our homes, but the reality in colonial times, less than 1/2 of 1% had soldiers quartered in them. Most of the quartering of soldiers were in unoccupied buildings. Well, now we basically have Marines and National Guard subject to the control of our executive, not the local civil authority, and they're housed in unoccupied places. So essentially, the type of quartering of soldiers de facto that we have now engaged in of using a militarized force subject to our executive is not too different than what the British monarchy did to the colonies. So, which was considered a grievance that, at least one of the grievances that made it legitimate for the colonists to declare their independence. They also said for cutting off, the Declaration said, for cutting off our trade with all parties of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. Okay, well, we now have trade wars. Most economists consider the tariffs a tax, and we do have a significant amount of trade restrictions, and all this is done without the consent because the Constitution requires that tariffs and taxes and revenues are all the purview of Congress, not the executive, not the president. So basically, we are being subject to a tax and tariff regime. We're having our trade cut off, and it's all done without our consent, because consent means it's done through the legislature, not through executive fiat. For depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. Well, we're picking people up off the street who are even in the British Empire in around, I guess, about 1215 it was, when the Magna Carta was signed and went into effect. The Magna Carta basically guaranteed for everyone in the jurisdiction, trial by jury, and certain, and certain rights that they as independent people were entitled to, that even the sovereign could not violate. Well, now we have a sovereign, a president, basically violating people's due process, depriving them of due process, depriving them of a writ of habeas corpus, depriving them of trial by jury, and just picking them up off the streets by a militarized force of ICE agents and backed up by Marines to take people off the streets without warrants, with what they call either probable cause or reasonable cause, which might be that which might be they picked up one person or two people who were Latino looking, who they had a warrant against, and then they see a whole bunch of people around them, and they say, "Gee, that these people are hanging out. They all must be illegals. So we don't need a warrant to pick them up. They're in a public place, and we're just going to grab them." So if we're wrong, we'll have to return them. But if we're, maybe we'll have to return them. So I think that all of these things were against what we people believed a legitimate government could do to its people. So we viewed the British Kingdom illegitimate, because it was taking certain actions against the colonists that the colonists said is, you lost your legitimacy as a government to be sovereign over us, because you have deprived us of what we believe are our natural civil liberties. And to the extent that you have done that, your government is no longer legitimate. One of the other things they also were complained about was with respect to restrictions on immigration into the country. So they felt the immigration should not have been left to the king, but to the states themselves. Each colony should have established their own immigration policies, and that was the policy upon the founding of the country, is that the immigration was an issue determined by each state. It was not something that the sovereign, the president, the executive had any oversight of. That was to be done exclusively by the states themselves. So I think that if we take a look at what was considered the way a free, self-sovereign people should live, and what's the legitimate role of government, and what it means to live independent, okay, as opposed to dependent. I would say that right now our dependency on the presidents is much, much greater than the dependency the colonists had on the king. Okay, even the king respected more due process in the colonies than the current president does over with respect to what are our inalienable rights. And what does inalienable rights mean? Inalienable rights means they're rights that we own, that they're our property, and nobody has the right to take them from us. So they're only under a few conditions that they could. So basically, we fought tyranny, and let's look at what we defined as tyranny. Okay, the income tax burden colonists face was about 1% to 2% of income. Okay, much, much higher than the income tax rate. So back then, the sovereign had a greater claim to our income. Basically, the sovereign was our partner. Now, the president is a partner right now, because we have a huge deficit, and we have high taxes. And even with our high taxes, we have a huge deficit. So the income tax burden was much, much lower. So the more money we get to keep, I think the more independent we are of government. So that should be self-evident, that being able to keep most of the money that you make makes you more independent, okay? And we are independent of government, and the government really doesn't have a lot of resources to persecute us or to govern over us, because basically the United States of America was built as an exercise in self-government. So we didn't replace one King George for another King George. The whole point was to get rid of the concept of the monarchy and the relationship between the subject and its sovereign, as opposed to citizen and its state and the state. So we were supposed to redefine that relationship in a way that made us freer, not less free. Okay. Then we talked about no taxation without representation. Well, what do we think it does is when we're promoting when we're promoting significant deficit spending, that definitely has to be financed by somebody sometime in the future. We have notifications that the Social Security and Medicare trust funds might run out of money in 7 to 8 years. So the question is for a long period of time, there's been warnings that the people who are the current beneficiaries of those programs are not adequately funding them. And so are we really, as a society, going to say when the funds run out and they start getting a discount of maybe about 20 to 25 cents on the dollar, that they'll reduce, that reduction in payments might be a quarter? And will they just say, no, I'm happy to accept 75 cents on the dollar now because I understand I didn't fund it? Or are they going to go to the new generation and say, look, there was a contract the government made with me, even though it's not really true a contract was government made. It's a trust fund, and the trust fund only can pay out what it takes in. And so they'll be basically saying as well, you have to fund, you're responsible for funding my underfunding of the benefits I expect to receive. So I'm taxing you for benefits I want to receive. That's taxation without representation. Now let's take a look at another area. Let's take a look at legal tender laws. Okay, legal tender laws, money. Okay, now we have money monopolies. Okay, during the colonial time, there was not a money monopoly. There were legal tender laws, but there were multiple currencies in circulation. It wasn't just one. So there was no concept. And the worst is our money monopoly, the dollar, is not just hegemony over us. We try and propose hegemony over the entire world. So the dollar we back up not by gold. Our currency used to be backed up by gold. During a Bretton Woods regime, when the pound sterling, a global standard as the reserve currency of the world, collapsed and was replaced by the dollar as the global reserve currency. The dollar we accepted to as given the fact that we now went to a dollar as reserve currency. We said in order to create credibility of people taking the dollar and trading in dollars as the reserve currency of the world, that it was our obligation to keep the dollar-U.S. gold relationship stable, constant. We failed at that. So after we failed at that and we untethered dollar from gold in 1971, when Nixon closed the convertibility, we ended up creating a new kind of collateral, which was the petrodollar. And the petrodollar was no longer backed by collateralized by us retaining sufficient gold reserves, so that we knew we would limit how much money we printed, based upon the fact that we could not print more money than the gold reserves we had. And for a very simple fact, if everyone who had a dollar decided they wanted to hold gold rather than dollars, we had to make sure that at that fixed price, everybody could convert their dollars, their dollars into gold. And if we don't have the gold, we end up defaulting. So that creates a hard budget constraint of us having to make sure that we don't print any more money relative to the ability to convert that at the fixed price into gold. And if we can't do that, then we know we're subject to a dollar default, and which would have been very, very bad for American credit. So instead of doing that, what we decided to do was just default on our obligation to allow people to take whatever dollars they held and convert it in gold at the dollar price we promised we would fix it towards, because our word doesn't mean very much. So to reinforce the fact that our word didn't mean very much, we basically decided to do something else. We went out, we basically met with some of the people in the Mideast, and we said, why don't you sell all your oil and invoice in dollars? and we'll use gunboat diplomacy to make sure everybody takes dollars, and we'll now can print as much money as we can, because ultimately now what's collateralizing the dollar is not sound fiscal policy, not sound monetary policy, but what's collateralizing the dollar now is our military. So we militarized the dollar and engaged in dollar hegemony. So that certainly was not consistent with the values embedded in the Declaration of Independence. In Washington, his farewell address said that basically we should have no permanent alliances, and that we should engage in commerce with the world, and we should be friendly with the world, engage in commerce in the world. And there was no intention of trying to make our dollar, the reserve currency of the world. We allowed some level of currency competition in our own country. So and we didn't allow the printing of fiat paper money. So the founders were pretty. There was a broad consensus that if you gave the government the ability to print money, that basically would guarantee that you'd live in a state of tyranny, because you'd eventually get a very big government, and you'd get the government doing a lot of other people spending other people's money, which was not the intention of what government had. Also, we didn't have an income tax at the time, so you had had better privacy rights, because it's not as if we had to disclose much. The colonists didn't have to disclose much about themselves to the British sovereign. Okay, they didn't have to file tax returns to the British sovereign. Most of the money was funded by some level of tariffs policy, and even though it was mostly funded by tariffs, because government was small, the tariffs were smaller then than they are now. So the tariffs were materially smaller that the colonists traded. So the colonists had lower income taxes. They didn't have any real budget deficit. Government spending in the colonies was about 2 to 3% of GDP. So basically, the British government was not very intrusive in the lives of the lives of the Americans, compared to what the American government now is intrusive into the lives of them. So there's no way anyone can really sit back and say, if they look objectively at the circumstances, can say we live more independent of government today than the colonists did when the colonists called the government tyrannical and decided to get rid of the government and declare independence. And let me give other examples: occupational permits and licensing requirements. Okay, they were very few and far between. In colonial times. Before we became independent, it's not like everything you needed to do you had to get an occupational, you had to get a license for, or some sort of permit issued by the government. There was very limited things that you needed to get approval from the government. Now you need approval from the government almost anything. You basically, back in colonial times, they lived in somewhat of a permissionless society, and now we live in a society where there's almost nothing that we can do without asking for permission first. So, and again, going back to the spending issue, they are 2 to 3% of GDP. Now we spend about 40% of GDP in the government. Okay, so they basically what was rejected also, because another thing that happened in 1776 was not just the Declaration of Independence. It was Adam Smith's tome called The Wealth of Nations, and at that point in time, we as a society that embraced two concepts, capitalism and freedom. And we already had embraced capitalism. The colonists were capitalists prior to the American Revolution, and they sustained those capitalist beliefs after the American Revolution. We were not predicated upon mercantilism, and right now we're embracing mercantilism. So, which is basically an economy to great extent directed by the sovereign, because the sovereign has great discretion to set tariff policies and trade policies, at the sole discretion, without the consent of the people, and decide who to reward and who to punish, rather than those decisions being made by the marketplace. So many of the allocation decisions of capital and our access to goods and services are determined without the legislature doing this, without really the voice of the people, because legislature is the voice of the people. The president is not the voice of the people. The legislature is the voice of the people. So, and that's why if you look at the division of powers, a very delicate division of powers contemplated in the Constitution was to convey much more power to the legislature, and the executive branch was basically role was to enforce the laws the legislature passed, not to write his or her own laws, and basically then say whatever laws I create through executive order, basically because I created them and I created them through executive order, basically I can undo anything the legislature does by executive order. And our currently executive is basically saying is, if I make the executive order, the Constitution says once I make an executive order, nobody has the right to even review my claim of my legitimacy to issue an executive order. So essentially, it's an assertion of an absolute power that cannot be disputed. So, and how is absolute? Because one of the things they say is I can ignore how Congress appropriates money because I can impound money. So if the government, if there's legislation passed saying, this is how the president should be spending, how the Treasury should be spending money, I as a president say, I'll take it under my own my own advisement, and then ultimately I'll decide where the money gets spent. So that's not what the Constitution says, but that's what this president asserts. So this president basically says whatever the courts do or the legislature does are just suggestions that he's free to either respect or ignore at his sole discretion, but that basically the only binding authority is the presidential authority, and Congress and the courts have no real binding authority. They're just advising and consenting, but have no binding authority, and that all binding authority resides, it solely with the executive. So that basically means that this president is asserting more executive power than the King of England did. So I don't know how we can claim that we are celebrating independence. Independence from what? Independence from one tyrant to be replaced by another tyrant? Or was the point to be independent of tyranny in and of itself? The objective of the independence of the independence was to create an experiment in self-government where individuals were self-sovereign, and self-sovereign individuals who would never be subject to tyranny again in their lives. So if we look at the circumstances right now, we have less privacy, we have higher taxes, we have less freedom of movement, we have higher debt burdens, we have higher deficits, we have more government intervention, we have more government intrusion, we have more licensing requirements, we have more permitting requirements, we have less currency competition, we have more military presence, we have more regulatory burdens, we have more disclosure burdens. So that's what we're claiming. That's what we're celebrating as being independent. Okay, that we now have not only less independence, significantly less independence than we had in colonial times before we rejected the king and we seceded from the king. Franklin, who might have been our wisest founder, said that the U.S. Constitution is likely to be administered for a course of years and in despotism when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. So I think that describes our current circumstances today, that we are so corrupted as a people, and that we need a despotic government. And so that's what we have, because we feel we need it, because we are so corrupted. And so I don't think we have anything to celebrate. I think we only should be in mourning for those that really love independence. We can't celebrate independence. We should be striving for independence rather than celebrating some concept of something that, people in 1776 had the courage to fight for, that we lack the courage. So what is there to celebrate? The fact that we're cowards, that we're corrupted, that we need a despot, and that we celebrate a despot, and how ironic is it that during this time where people were, quote, celebrating Independence Day, so really, they should celebrate Dependence Day, that, a whole bunch of people are infants that need a despotic president. And I'm not saying that Trump is the only despot. I'm saying we've been governed by despotism for a long period of time. That's not a recent phenomenon. I think the type of executive power Trump is claiming during peacetime is something that has no parallel But I'm not going to make a claim that Trump invented the concept of the despotic president or the tyrant. I think every president we have has wanted to be a despot. Only Trump is more successful at accomplishing that goal. The other thing that I missed that I should add is one of the other claims was there should be no permanent standing army in peacetime. Not only do we have a huge permanent standing army, and now I want to get to it. I'll go through this in the context of the one big beautiful bill. What a name, that was passed. Also, people celebrating this Independence Day, July 4th weekend as a celebration. Really, how pathetic it is. Let's think about what was celebrated. Okay, one is we now have a budget allocated to immigration enforcement that is about $175 billion. To put that in the context, only 2 countries in the world spend more on their military than right now what we're spending on immigration enforcement. Only the USA and China spend more on their military. So right now our budget for enforcement of immigration laws in the country will grow to be basically the size that Russia spends on total military spending. And Russia today is at war with Ukraine. So if we take a look at the whole Russian military budget, while it's in a state of war against another country, basically we could say that ICE and Department of Homeland Security is at war with the American people. And think about the rights. What are the rights unique to ICE agents? Unique to ICE agents. Well, ICE agents can operate not with the same requirements as our police department needs. They're less one is ICE agents are not accountable when they operate in local jurisdictions. They're not accountable to the local government. They're only accountable to the sovereign, the president. Okay, so they're not accountable to the civil government in that jurisdiction. Okay, which was also something that was also one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence, is that who's ever responsible for security in a jurisdiction should be accountable to the civil government of that jurisdiction itself. So what we're doing is we're nationalizing a police force that's going into local jurisdictions that are not subject to the governance of that civil government in that region, that they're only accountable to the sovereign. And what's unique about them? Well, we'll have a whole bunch of National Guards with ICE agents and Marines, because the Marines now, I think I read, are now on 3 or 4 other states besides Los Angeles, besides California, and who knows how many states they'll end up being. Well, now with this huge budget they'll have, they could be in every state. Who knows? But basically, the Trump has claimed the right. Nobody's stopping the right of basically having a military force, domestically, and a militarized force domestically that is not subject to the same type of obtention of warrants as our local police force has. So right now we'll have a whole militarized force going in that's not subject to any guidance or oversight by the local government, that can basically pick up people on the streets without a warrant. All they need is what they call probable cause or reasonable cause. So according to their best judgment, that of course only the executive can. So basically you'll have to go to, Trump or Kristi Noem to basically, or Tom, Himmler Homan, and it would be for them to judge whether they thought any of their ICE agents operated in bad faith. And it would be subject only to them. And basically, they're making this statement that with the immunity they think they should have, is that no third party should be able to come in judgment of any of them. So think about spending all this money on a militarized force with Marines, National Guards, and ICE agents roaming around the streets, basically being able to pick up anybody on a sidewalk. And if you think I'm putting fear into you, you should be fearful, because they have that right and they're claiming that right. Okay, they could pick you up, send you off to any country around the world without any due process. That's what they're asserting. Okay, and what does the court say? Well, we think you're entitled to due process, but really, we can't do anything to stop the president. The president decides they don't want to give you due process. Maybe Congress will step in and impeach the president. But the absence of Congress doing that, well, it's not wrong. You have a lawless president, but it's your choice. Okay, so wait for his term to end, and then maybe elect somebody different, or hope and pray that the Congress will do something about him. But all we can do is just say it's lawless, and our authority stops there. So. So I think that is really pretty absurd. Now let's take a look at some of the other features of the one big beautiful book. Well, one of the things our founding fathers said, okay, among the many things they said when they founded a generation, and these are all things that if we don't follow this formula, leads to tyranny. Okay, they said debt leads to tyranny. Okay, so let's take a look at this bill. Okay, of the one big beautiful bill. The tax cuts that already had been put in place previously that were about to expire. Remember, when the last budget was passed, and CBO does the Congressional Budget Office does their estimate of the impact it has fiscally, they say, okay, here's the tax cuts, but the tax cuts are expected to expire. So we're going to assume that they expire when they're supposed to expire. And so when we calculate the long-term benefits, the long-term calculations of our deficit, we're going to assume at the date of expiration that they actually expire, because that's what the statute says. So we'll assume that what the statute says will happen, and they will expire. So when they calculate the long-term impact on the deficit, they're assuming that the tax cuts will expire the day they say they will expire. And then the president goes around saying, see, this is not really that increasing the deficit so much, because don't worry, this is only temporary. So, but the temporary often in government becomes permanent. So here, what we'll see is they're now making the tax cuts permanent. So whatever analysis that was done on how fiscally irresponsible that tax cut was, it's even worse, because when they were talking about how fiscally irresponsible it was under the assumption that these tax cuts would expire at the date they were supposed to expire and not be renewed. So now let's take a look at this current bill, when President says, well, we're being fiscally responsible because all the tax cuts we're actually paying for, but we're paying for them in a way that you'll never feel them. So I'll tell you why that statement is true. If you take a look at some of the new things that was promised in this tax bill, like the no taxes on tips and stuff like that. If you take a look at some of the tax provisions that provide other deductions, other tax benefits to people, almost all of them are temporary. Most of them will expire at 2028, the end of this term, including these the Trump accounts, where basically Trump wants to pump up the stock market by basically giving everybody $1,000 account, which Wall Street will be happy about, because they'll all be invested in the stock market. So the government is now taking its own money, I guess making people the beneficiary of them. But how are people getting the beneficiary of it? The government is basically going out borrowing money that other people will have to pay for in order to buy stocks, because that's what's happening. Other people will have to borrow money today to fund people's funds. And with the hope that this index of stocks outperforms the cost of borrowing, and if it doesn't, then basically this will have a negative net present value. So because this is not being funded from equity, this is being funded from incremental borrowing. So so we're increasing the deficit. We're taking people's money from the future, to give somebody a benefit today, and selling that as a free lunch and putting it into the stock market. So maybe Trump now will be basically forcing the government to deploy more money into the stock market, to pump up the stock market. And then he wants to promote in a very Keynesian fashion, increase spending today by making there be more disposable income, by giving temporary tax benefits to a bunch of people, and then say that they will be paid for by spending cuts in the future. Now, some of those spending cuts begin after the midterm elections, and most of them occur after the next general election in 2028. So let's see what we're assuming if we're real. So right now we have an increase in and I think, well, independent of what anybody thinks about Elon Musk, when Elon Musk posted on X on January 30th, and I'm reading, this was his post. It is obvious with the insane spending of this bill, which increases the debt ceiling by a record $5 trillion, that we live in a one-party country, the Porky Pig Party. Okay. So I think that, and his next statement, time for a new political party that actually cares about the people. And then Trump says that's insane and it's off the rails. No, what's insane and off the rails is government spending. Okay. Whatever people think about Elon Musk, and I'm certainly not a fan of Elon Musk, this is insane. Okay. It is insane that we pass all these taxes. We say, oh, it's not going to be so bad because it'll be paid by spending cuts. Those spending cuts might or might not happen. What we have is we have non-binding tax cuts today. We have binding tax cuts today with non-binding spending cuts in the future. Okay. So because 2028, people can look at it and say, tell me who's going to run for president, and sit back and say in 2028, and going to say, guess what? I'm now going to have a huge tax increase because all those tax cuts that expired, I'm not going to renew any of them, which then the Republicans will then go out and say, or MAG will go and say, oh, gee, this is a huge increase in taxes. All these people were used to all these tax cuts, and by no longer extending these tax cuts, you're gonna have a huge tax increase. And at the same time, these tax cuts go away, the spending cuts go into effect. So this is what Trump is transferring to the next president. And people say that's a beautiful bill. Really, how stupid are the American people that they're completely uneducated, about really what's inside the bill and what the consequences are. Tell me, just like right now, the Republicans are saying, you're going to have the largest tax increase in history by not extending the tax cuts. So that's what will happen in 2028. So whatever, however, right now, when this is being scored by the Congressional Budget Office, they're scoring it as if in 2028, every tax cut that's expired will expire, and that every tax and that every spending cut that's supposed to happen in 2028, that's supposed to be triggered in 2028, will actually go into effect. Okay, so if you take a look at what you think the fiscal impact of this one big beautiful bill, okay, whatever number Congress is coming up with is such a low estimate of the truth for reality, is because I don't know who really believes. Okay, I don't know how stupid you have to believe that in 2028 every one of those tax cuts will be left to expire, and every one of the spending cuts that are supposed to be triggered then are going to go into effect. Okay, and if that doesn't happen, that means the deficit will grow significantly more, than what's being budgeted, and it's already expected to grow very large. So the level of fiscal irresponsibility in this is, and the pandering involved. Okay, yes, okay. Why should anyone who works? Why should two people that work equally hard for their money get the same amount of income from their efforts and be taxed at different rates? Okay, that's serving. Maybe I'll go to the people that work for me and I'll say, and I'm changing the compensation scheme. I'm going to pay you minimum wage, and every week, if I'm happy with the work you do, I'll give you a nice tip. Okay, and therefore all their money will be tax-free. And let's see how much reduction in revenues the government gets as a consequence of everybody turning their employees into basically service providers, where they pay a minimum wage, and if they do a nice job, they'll tip them well. And of course, as long as the employees promise the same amount of tips as they were in wages in the past, they'll all love to be paid in tips rather than wages, because now they won't be subject to paying an income tax on that. So, why shouldn't everybody have the same right to have their work being lower wages and more and more tips, so that they can significantly increase, their after-tax wages? Why should that benefit only be, to certain professions? So we're supposed to treat everyone the same. We're talking about having, quote, a colorblind society, not distinguishing one person from another. And here we are distinguishing people. We're distinguishing people by the nature of the job that they have in certain types of jobs. We're basically saying if you get to have, if you get a certain amount of money that you collect, okay, and also including some benefits from overtime. If you have the type of job that you get overtime, you're going to get now some other benefit associated with that. And then there are other increases in things that you can get claim deductions on. But if you take a look at who actually files tax returns where they itemize deductions, about 10% of the American public itemize deductions. So basically, the itemization of deductions are for the wealthiest people. So whenever there's an opportunity to use more deductions against taxable income, who are the beneficiaries of that? Really, the wealthy are the beneficiaries of that. So basically, we're increasing a lot of debt that everybody will have to pay in order to give wealthy people more ability to shelter their taxable income. So I don't know if you think that's a big, beautiful bill that you want to tax more people in the future. You want to make people in the future debt slaves, being indentured servitude to the government in order just to pump up the economy for a couple of years to make one president look good. I don't care who that president is, whether it's Biden or Trump or Clinton or anyone else. Okay, it's complete. It is fiscal insanity. It is fiscal insanity, and this will increase the budget deficit significantly larger because, again, I don't believe that anyone really believes that we're going to let every single one of those tax benefits expire, in 2028. And I don't believe we're going to trigger every single one of those spending cuts that are supposed to be triggered in 2028. So given the fact that none of that is going to happen, as bad as the budget deficit is supposed to already be increased as a result of these policies, they're going to increase very much more. So for people to say, oh, give Trump a chance to show his fiscal responsibility, no, Trump is proving himself to be more fiscally irresponsible than Joe Biden. So, and Joe Biden, he called the worst president in the history of the country. Maybe Trump's working to be the GOAT of the worst presidents of the histories of the country. But if this is considered good politics, then it's sad to me how stupid the American people are if they can't understand the adverse consequences of a policy that basically is a temporary, huge tax increase, just temporary in nature, that's causing a huge increase in the deficit, which is the reason why they want to increase the debt ceiling $5 trillion. Okay, that really is not come remotely close to being paid for. So the claim is that it's being paid for, but that's just a lie. So we already have $37 trillion fiscal deficit, and oh, by the way, I didn't even mention this after 2028, because the next presidential term could also be the point in time where Social Security runs out of money and the discount happens. So now the next president will have to face, what will the next president have to face? Basically telling people, I'm going to give you a huge tax increase. I'm going to significantly cut spending. And by the way, I'm going to have to increase your taxes more because we have a bankrupt Social Security system. So we don't want the seniors to not get 100 cents on the dollar. Somebody's going to have to pay for that. So now we're going to have to increase the taxes to everyone even more. So not only are they losing the tax cuts, they're going to be subject to further tax increases to basically fund the unfunded part of the Social Security, and Medicare. So if people think that's good policy for us to basically give ourselves huge tax cuts, be fiscally irresponsible today, so we screw people, 10 years from now, but maybe we're screwing another cohort of people, and that's okay. And to think that that's really what the founders had in mind, and this is what we celebrate as a great country. No, I think that this doesn't remotely resemble the wishes, the dreams, the hopes of our founders, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, who fought for it, and how much we've wasted and really completely assassinated the inheritance they left us, which was an inheritance of capitalism and freedom. And now, I don't know what to call this policy: populism, mercantilism, fascism, and why do I call it to some extent fascism? Right now we have Trump, I guess, negotiating with the Chinese government over the future of TikTok. Well, if that negotiation is anything like the U.S. Steel negotiation, where what happened with U.S. Steel is that there was a golden share issued to the U.S. government. But if you read the language of that golden share that I think was obtained by somebody from a Freedom of Information Act, actually it conveys the rights of governance to Trump, okay, as president. So basically, the governance control over U.S. Steel is now in the hands of Donald Trump. So if they want to do anything outside of their day-to-day operations, they basically need his approval or the approval of anyone he designates. But he has pretty much absolute control over the governance. If any capital markets transactions, any shutting down of plants, anything that's outside of them just running the business as it's being run today on a day-to-day, if there's any decision that makes any change from the status quo, needs his approval. So his personal approval. So what'll happen after he's president and how that will be triggered to the next, I have no idea. But you can, if you try and look it up yourself, and you'll see that the rights of government are conveyed to him, okay, not the U.S. government, to him as president, though. So it's not like he gets to take those rights if he leaves. But who knows? He might claim he does, and those rights go with him wherever he goes. With him, you could never tell. So he might like do all the deals. Can you imagine every company that goes in front of the SEC because it wants to do an acquisition or merger that has to grant him a golden share, where basically the American people have no property rights in the benefits. So if the investment comes great, there's no benefit to the American people because the American people are not getting shares. He's just getting a golden share, so that basically he's controlling, from a governance perspective, the company. So so who knows whether this is a precedent that he'll apply if he gets away with applying it with U.S. Steel, which so far he has, or it seems like he has. That basically this could be a model for any company that wants to do any transaction. The price they'll have to pay is they'll have to give Donald Trump a golden share, and basically Trump will then run every any company that wants to do a capital markets transaction knows that the price will be he has to get a golden share. So we'll see more. We'll learn more to see what the final resolution, if there is one, with respect to TikTok, on is this golden share also involved in TikTok, where he basically will be running TikTok. So I guess the most watched, or one of the most watched social media platforms out there, he potentially could have governance control over. So and we would not consider that government controlled media. So so these points are so far from people being an independent country. So because we are corrupt, and we are corrupt, but the fact is that we want government to do a lot of things for us, that back in colonial times, there was never an expectation that the government would do things for us. It was that we understood that as individualists, we were responsible for doing these things for ourselves. There was never the concept of the government taking care of us. There was a concept of we're responsible for taking care of ourselves, and we want the government to do as little as possible. What we didn't want was the government to be able to take any arbitrary actions against us. Okay, what we didn't want was the government to create any claims on us without our consent. No taxation without representation. That if you're going to create a burden on me, you need my consent for doing the burden on me. Okay, if you're going to limit, you can't limit who I can trade with without my consent. Okay, you can't impose taxes on me without my consent. You can't impose any burden on me without my consent. Okay, that was the concept. Okay, so basically everything required the consent of the governed. And now we have very little consent of the governed. Monetary policy and the money we paid, nothing to do with the consent of the government. Okay, our tariff policy, nothing can send to the government. Us fighting wars against other countries and using our military force elsewhere doesn't require consent to the government. And if you take even a look at the stupidity of now people saying, "Oh, gee," when people say, "I like the immigration policy," today, and I like immigration enforcement, I want mass deportations. It's one thing to say, "Do you like mass deportations?" Okay, so it's a fair question to ask people, and it's fair to see people say, "Yes, I like mass deportations." So, but the reality is in order for us to do mass deportations, we need about $1,500 for every single taxpayer. Okay, so yes, since you say you like it, that means we assume you'll pay for it. Okay, so it's a very different question to ask: do you want this, and there's no cost involved, or do you want this? Here's what it costs. Here's the bill. Since you said you like it, you want to pay for it. So I want to know if they asked if they asked every household, every person who has a full-time job, if they said, we're going to now do mass deportations, and you're going to send us all a check of $1,500 each approximately to implement mass deportations, I wonder if we'd still get the same overwhelming majority to do that. If people said, we want to bomb Iran, okay, Iran doesn't represent any real existential threat to us. But we want to bomb them. Here's how much it's going to cost us to do that. You want to pay for it. Send in the check, and we'll bomb Iran. Okay, and the absurdity is now we're asserting that one-time acts of bombing, are not acts of war, even though there's no imminent or direct threat to us. So that basically, if you believe that principle, because that's the principle as I've been asserted, Trump can sit back and say, well, I'm going to bomb London because London didn't agree to my tariff demands. Moscow has too many nuclear weapons. I'm going to bomb Moscow. It's only a one-time thing, but I'm going to bomb Moscow. I'm going to also go bomb. One day I'm just going to go out and I'm going to tell the military, go to every country that refuses to accept my tariff policy and just do one bombing to say, you better accept my terms, or I'm going to keep bombing you until you accept my terms. And by the way, every country that has a nuclear weapon that I don't want to have them to have a nuclear weapon, bomb them as well. Bomb their nuclear facilities. Bomb Beijing. Okay, bomb India. Bomb the UK. Bomb Germany. Bomb France. Bomb them all because I don't want them to have nuclear weapons. Okay, I asserted that. Now, the principle that has been established in the bombing of Iran is that basically the same people said they can do that. Now, they might say it's not likely that would happen, that the president would give that order, but would you think you would want the president to have that power unilaterally? If you want the president to have that power unilaterally, then if they use it, don't complain about it, okay? So you're really endorsing the president being able to do that because you want the president to do that, because I don't know why anyone would want the president to have that type of authority. It's just absurd. I don't care who the president. This is not against Trump. Okay, this is against whoever occupies the White House. Okay, we need to get back to the consent of the people. People have to wake up to really read the Declaration of Independence, read the history of the ratification of these documents, read the correspondence associated with people who were at the Constitutional Convention, read Madison's notes to the Constitutional Convention, read the Articles of Confederation, read what people thought were the failures of the Articles of Confederation that led to the Constitution, read some of the documents that pre-existed the Declaration of Independence. There was a document written by George Mason and a document written by Richard Henry Lee. Read those documents. Read the process of the ratification of the U.S. Of the Constitution and debates and why it was a difficult task. Read the arguments made by those who argued against the Constitution in the anti-federalist papers. And read the history of the Bill of Rights. Become educated. Appreciate really what it means to be independent, what it means to be self-sovereign, to understand what the American dream was. The American dream has been assassinated. Okay, I'm not celebrating the assassination of the American dream. I'm not celebrating the illusion of independence when we're more dependent on government today than we were in the colonial times. Okay, that what we define what at that point in time, what colonists perceived as tyranny. Okay, the level, if we look at the colonial definition of tyranny, that how to unshackle ourselves from the British Empire, okay, we face a significantly more. It's not even a small amount. The level of tyranny we confront is so much greater than what the colonials faced, before they threw the British out, and created our own government. First, the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution. We went over 100 years in this country's history where we didn't have fiat paper money, where we didn't have a Federal Reserve System, we didn't have a regulatory state. We had federal government was about 3.5% of GDP. That total government on federal, state, local spending was under 8% of GDP. And we had very limited regulation. We didn't have a standing army. Okay, we were able to, in World War II, get the private sector produce the necessary resources for us to fight the war in multiple fronts in a short period of time. That was the greatness of this country. Not that we had a permanent standing army, was that once we were threatened, there was a social consensus that we were going to take our productive capacity and do better than anyone else because we adapt better than anyone else. Okay, but it wasn't the need for us to have a permanent standing army. Okay, we didn't need a permanent standing army, that we had so much productive capacity that we can convert that productive capacity into what society valued at that most point in time, which was our own security. And at that point in time, we were able to convert people making cars into tanks, people making, and then people making the airplanes and all the things necessary. And that was basically done not by the federal government being top down, giving instructions on how on how the company should work to produce military things. It was mostly the government saying is, these are the things we want to buy, and the private sector doing what the private sector does, figures out if there's consumer demand for it, we figure out how to supply it at the best product at the lowest cost possible. That's what capitalism produced. That's what freedom produced. We came to a point that we voluntary decided, through our consent, that we were going to divert our money, resources, and talent towards defending the country. And people made that decision voluntarily. And then when we were then very quickly, that's when we showed how great as a country are, which we've showed for many years, is our ability to adapt quicker and better than anyone else, because we were the freest. We're not the freest anymore. And we don't adapt very well, because instead of letting the marketplace make allocation decisions, which does a lot better job, we have more bureaucratic decisions than market-based decisions. So I think if we take a look at we don't really need a standing army. We don't need this size. If the American people are told, here's a problem, we're a threat, we have all this productive capacity, okay, because we were the freest people in the country, okay, once we understood that was a threat, that we consented to was a threat, we all as a society decided that this is how we wanted to allocate our time, our money, our resources, and what we wanted to give priority in production, because we thought it was the most valuable thing to produce at that moment in time. And when we made that decision, okay, we went from basically having, almost no military in place, to being the most powerful military in the matter of a couple of years. So, so we did an, incredible job at that, basically trusting the marketplace, because again, the government said, the military leaders said, we need these weapons, and private companies figured out how to get them what they needed. Okay, and they did a great job at that. So, and ultimately, the American people paid for it. People bought war bonds. They wanted to support the war effort, and over time, those war bonds were paid off. Okay, now we don't buy war bonds. We have a Federal Reserve Bank that prints money. Okay, we're not consenting to the federal government printing money. As a matter of fact, they're printing money against us, because by printing money, they're debasing the purchasing power of our money. So the government is making us poor by the fact is that they're not going to us to fund these efforts. They just want the Fed to print money to fund the government. So that way the Fed, they can fund their government spending without the consent of the people, because they can rely upon money printing to fund the government rather than us consenting to buy the government by either paying taxes or us buying the debt. If we don't want to buy the debt, they'll ask the Fed to buy the debt by printing more money. And as the Fed is doing that, they're debasing our money, debasing our purchasing power, making us poorer. So none of this produces greater freedom for us. It only produces more centralized government, more authoritarianism, more autocracy, more despotism, more tyranny, and that is independent to whoever occupies, the White House. As I said, I think Trump is just a lot better. While maybe other presidents who wanted to be would-be tyrants were only like a C student in tyranny, Trump's an A+ student in tyranny, so he's just better at it than the others. It's not that his desire for being despotic, I think, is any different than any other person who occupies the White House. Only he's a lot better at the game. So, but I don't think we have anything to celebrate. To me, it was just a National Day of Mourning, and every day I continue to be in mourning over what was the greatest. I thought the United States would be a light among all nations through a country that really epitomized self-sovereignty, individual freedom, and capitalism and freedom. And what do I mean by capitalism? Where transactions were driven by the marketplace that are on a voluntary basis, with limited to no intervention or intrusion on the part of any sort of coercive force. That everything we do, or just to the extent of almost everything we did, would be as a result of us voluntarily entering into transactions. That was the American dream. That was the dream of Thomas Jefferson. That was the dream of George Washington, of Benjamin Franklin, of James Madison, of Samuel Adams, of Thomas Paine. That was the dream when those people, the 55, 56 people who signed the Declaration, that was a dream of what America would be. Okay, so we've turned that dream into a nightmare. Nothing to celebrate at all. So I'd like to thank everyone who has decided to watch this first What the Wernick. I'm not having a regular schedule. I will do these when I feel that there's something that inspires me to talk about. Today I'm inspired by the Independence Day and my sadness over the fact that so few people read these founding documents, so few people take them seriously. People think that they're antiquated ideas, they're timeless ideas. The fact that anyone thinks they're antiquated ideas, is really sad. So I really urge people, read these founding documents. Try and prove Ben Franklin wrong. It's as so much tyranny we live in today, there is an ability to reverse it. There is ability for us to reclaim our voice, to reclaim our power. And I'm not saying that Elon Musk and his third party the answer is, but the answer might be a third party. And right now he is right. There is only one party out there. It is the Porky Pig Party. It's the party is that government is never big enough. Okay. So government needs to do more and more and more. Sometimes the disagreement on who should be the beneficiaries of that, and who should fund it. But there is a consent that government should do whatever government does today, it should do even more tomorrow. So however intrusive government is in our life today, it should be even more intrusive tomorrow. So there is a consent in DC, and MAGA is part of that consent. That government should do more, that government should be bigger, that government should be more intrusive in our lives. And there is no party that represents a perspective of the limited government. There is no party out there, that would repeat Ronald Reagan's speeches, and that believes in the type of Reaganism or the type of conservatism of a Calvin Coolidge. So the party of the limited government just doesn't exist. So to say it's absurd or ridiculous for us to even have a political party that will advocate for a limited government, I think is that I think is insane. And I want to make one more final parting point. Musk is right that if you have just a small block of, when the margin between Democrats and Republicans are so small, it doesn't take a large block to basically impede government spending. And we have a recent history of that. Okay. Barack Obama came in as a big spender when he was elected president. We had a whole bunch of Tea Party people, not a lot, but it was probably, I think, under 20 people. But given the fact that the control of the Senate and the House were pretty close, the party that had the marginal party that had bargaining leverage was the Tea Party. So when we had the threat of basically defaulting on our debt obligations because the Tea Party was blocking the passage of increasing the debt ceiling, what did we get? We got sequestration. The most since Bill Clinton in this century, in this 21st century, okay, the only years that we had some level of constraint on government spending were the years related to sequestration. Was when the Tea Party, a small group of people, got to Democrats and Republicans, said, we really want government to be big, but at the end, we don't want the government to default. So they ended up coming up to an agreement to sequester spending, so that they began to limit the growth of spending. So for a couple of years, when sequestration went into effect, those were the years that we had the smallest growth of government spending in this century. So it worked. Just a small group of people. Again, given the fact that the margin of difference between Democrats and Republicans were not big, it didn't need a big block of people who then used their bargaining power smartly because they operated as a block. They operated as a united block. And I think that that's what Massey had hoped to accomplish when he had announced, or he thought he had 10 people along with him, that 10 people would have blocked the one big beautiful bill. And what we probably would have seen out of it is they would have had a choice. Either they would have been able to just attack Massey and gone and had the U.S. go into default, or they would have said, gee, we recognize we really have to cut spending more, and they would have cut spending. I think they probably would have, and this is just pure speculation, they probably just would have cut spending. So the point I really want to make is that Musk is right. We don't need a large block of people who are independent of the two parties, who want to represent the American people and want to represent the American people by beginning to shrink the deficit. And the best way, the only real credible way of doing that, is reducing the scope of government, limiting the government by limiting spending, and that there is no part that these two parties have failed at that. And we have a history of them failing at that, in spite of all the promises of each party to try and do something at deficit reduction. They both failed. So we can't keep doing what's insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Okay. So we have the record of the first Trump term, which is a huge increase in deficit spending. Then we had Biden, huge increase in deficit spending. Now we have Trump again, huge increase in deficit spending. So supposedly Trump was the anti-establishment party. Well, the anti-establishment party is giving more money to the government and increasing our deficits. And decreasing our liberty and freedoms and increasing our surveillance. So we need people that will represent free, independent, self-sovereign Americans, and that party doesn't exist. So I think Musk's claim for that there should be a new party, well, maybe it's not his party and maybe it's not the America Party, but we need something, and we can't doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So, and it's going to have to come from us. It's our responsibility. Okay, we can't look for other people to do it for us. We got to do it ourselves. That's what it means to be an American. So, for all of you that have watched this, I want to thank you very much. I'll be back in about an hour with another with another fine points. So I'll stop here so I can take a break and come back shortly with Bruce and Ryan. And thank you everyone who watched that. I also would encourage people, before I really shut off now, is please, if you have questions, I want to know what you'd like to hear from me talk about. So if you have suggestions on topics, please submit them. If you have questions that you want to ask me, please submit them. and I'll do my best to address your topics, to talk about things that you'd like me to talk about if I think I have the skill to talk about it. And if there are questions that, as long as they're not too personal, I'm happy to answer them. Personal questions I won't answer. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.